Welcome to our first lecture of the week, and today we will conclude our World War II unit as we discuss the end of the war and also take a look at the beginning of post-war American society, life in America in the immediate post-war decades, and the planning for that post-war American society. And in fact, we will actually start there today and discuss a major component of post-war American life and the planning that went behind that and how it affected lives of millions of Americans in particularly the first decade plus after the war ended. And then we will conclude, we'll go back to the war itself and examine the military events that resulted in the end of the war in the summer of 1944 and the spring and summer of 1945. So I want to start today by discussing the GI Bill and its tremendous impact on American life in the immediate post-war years. It's one of the major pieces of legislation that is passed during Franklin Roosevelt's presidential administration, and it's a very significant law that really, truly affected millions of Americans' lives going forward. So let's start there. It's 1944. The outlook for victory in World War II is promising for America. America's political leaders are encouraged by the progress that the American and Allied troops are making in Europe and in the Pacific theater in Asia. And so they're beginning to think about life in a post-war era. What would that look like in America? And that prompted a series of questions. How would American troops reassimilate into civilian life once they returned from the war? How would that impact America's economy? If you remember, the Great Depression had lasted for more than a decade and really didn't end completely until America entered the war, and the workforce was needed to mobilize the American military and provide the supplies, equipments, transportation units that they needed for the war. So what happens when there is no war in the late 1940s and in the 1950s? All these troops are home. What happens to all the women who took jobs in factories and in offices while the men were overseas? Is America ripe for a potential second economic depression with unemployment rates again climbing to unimaginable heights? These were very real concerns that were on the minds of Americans, both rank and file Americans, but especially American political leaders. And they wanted to try to be proactive and do whatever they could to assure a relatively seamless transition for the American troops returning to civilian life in America. It was never going to be a completely seamless transition because you don't go from being a soldier in an active war for years to domestic life in America and civilian life without some sort of psychological adjustment that you have to make. And many American troops suffered with that psychological adjustment of going from the battlefields where they were trying to kill other enemy troops to working an office job or working in a factory or, interacting with friends and family that didn't serve in the wars. And we see elements of what we now would call post-traumatic what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, and as we know is a common thing amongst those who serve in the military. There were elements of this at play back in the 1940s with the end of World War II, but America's psychological industry had not quite accurately identified that as at that time and come up with a name for it that the public readily knew. Anyway, Congress decided to try to aid the returning military veterans through legislation, which was supported by FDR. They passed the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944. This piece of legislation is more commonly known as the GI Bill, and it provided a variety of economic benefits to returning military veterans. The primary benefits that they provided were tuition for college and higher education for returning military veterans, relatively affordable and accessible home loans and mortgages for returning military veterans, and there were also some unemployment benefits as well for those military veterans that came back and struggled to find work for a while after they returned from the war. Some historians have actually argued that the GI Bill is an extension of the New Deal policies of the 1930s that FDR spearheaded and passed, got through Congress and signed into law, and that the GI Bill is that's sort of last signature achievement of New Deal era legislation from the FDR presidency. Many other historians, however, assert that the New Deal officially ended in 1938 with the passage of the Fair Labor Standards Act. But similar to Social Security and some of the regulations from the Glass-Steagall Act, such as the FDIC and the establishment of the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Committee, those elements of the New Deal are still with us today in some way, shape, or form. They've been altered a little bit, but they're the core of what those bills provided, those legislation provided, is still with us today. And the GI Bill still exists today. Again, it's been adjusted and amended here and there, tweaked, if you will, but it still exists today, and it's something that many military veterans take advantage of. We see kids today graduate from high school and go directly into the military for several years and then get out of the military and go to college and use GI Bill benefits to pay for college. Or ROTC students at a college or university are often on some sort of financial aid package that's part of the GI Bill, and they, after they graduate, they go on to serve in the military for on active duty for 5 years, but the trade-off is the college tuition benefits that they get through the GI Bill. So let's talk about the impact of the GI Bill. What exactly did it do, and how did it affect Americans on a human level, on a societal level? Many military veterans, as you might imagine, took advantage of the opportunities provided by the GI Bill. In particular, these veterans enrolled in post-secondary education, which would be colleges and universities, junior colleges, technical and vocational schools, post-high school education, basically, in America. We see a tremendous boom in enrollment. America experiencing a tremendous boom in enrollment in those type of schools, in higher education in general, as it soared from 1.5 million Americans nationwide enrolled in post-secondary education in 1940 to 3.6 million Americans enrolled in post-secondary educational institutions by 1960. That is a tremendous surge, a tremendous influx of new students, additional students that enabled colleges to grow in enrollment and grow in physical capacity as well, in terms of buildings being built for classes as well as residence halls, etc. This enabled millions of Americans to earn either a bachelor's degree or an associate's degree or a technical vocational certificate because they could finally afford the cost of post-secondary education. Before World War II, before the Montgomery GI Bill came into effect, post-secondary education was considered something of a luxury in American life. It was something that middle class, upper middle class, and especially affluent Americans participated in and took advantage of, but working class Americans, if you will, lower income Americans, often did not attend a college or a university or a technical vocational school and pursue post-secondary education because they simply couldn't afford it. And they needed to get out of high school, or in some cases get out of school even before they graduated from high school and get right into the working world, whether that was working, in a factory or some other industrial type of job, or working in an agricultural profession or domestic service, or whatever the case may be. But now, all of a sudden, with the GI Bill, these military veterans were taking advantage of the financial aid provided by the federal government to earn their bachelor's degrees, their associate's degrees, their technical vocational certificates, which led to gave them a credential that ultimately led to them earning a better job, or a job that had more potential for higher salaries and job security down the road. And that those jobs were largely in the white-collar professional sectors of the economy, office jobs, if you will. In addition to the higher education component of the GI Bill, many American veterans used the GI Bill benefits to acquire affordable home loans and mortgages, and they used that to purchase homes, and frequently they purchased homes in the suburbs, which had existed in America before World War II, but the suburbs really undergo a period of dramatic growth during the post-war decades, particularly the late 1940s through the late 1960s. It's sort of a boom time, if you will, for suburbs in America and for suburban communities to either crop up or expand as more and more homes were being built and more families were moving into the suburbs. We'll get into the suburbs in greater detail later this week, but many of the military veterans that were buying their first homes were buying homes in suburban communities, such as Levittown, New York, which is on Long Island. That was one of the major suburbs that developed and grew substantially from the late 1940s through the early to mid 1960s. So the suburbs grow at a rapid rate because military veterans in great numbers are using their GI Bill benefits to purchase homes. These home loans enabled these Americans to become, frankly, upwardly mobile. and vault from a low-income working class lifestyle into a solid middle-class lifestyle. So essentially, from a socioeconomic standpoint, these Americans that are taking advantage of the GI Bill to earn a college education or technical certification, or using it to buy a home, or perhaps a combination of the two, they are literally changing their social status by going from low income working class into solid middle class. Home ownership is the American dream. It was back then. It still is today to a great extent, because when you own a home, you gain equity in the house, and in many cases, often, particularly if you stay in a home that you purchased for a long time, the home appreciates in value, and you can sell it at a higher rate than you purchased it for. That doesn't happen when you're renting an apartment. Whether you're renting an apartment in a city or a small town, you're paying monthly rent, but you're not accruing equity in the apartment unit that you're living in, because when you move out of there, you can't sell your apartment unit. You just pay off whatever the final month's rent and move on, and maybe get your security deposit back, and that's about it. That's not the case with home ownership. So that is a major development in post-war America, and a great deal of it can be attributed directly to the GI Bill and the affordable home loans and mortgages that were available for the GI Bill. So this all results in significant economic growth as well, growth in the higher education sector, as colleges and universities are constructing new buildings for classrooms, and as well as new residence halls for this influx of students. And they're also hiring additional faculty and staff, again, to help accommodate this tremendous influx in enrollment. It's also a significant economic growth period for the construction industry, both in the residential sector and the commercial sector, as all of these suburban neighborhoods and developments and homes are being built. Other commercial construction is also being built at a rapid rate at this time, in terms of businesses, supermarkets, strip shopping centers, etc., and eventually shopping malls. Those are all things that begin to get built in the 1950s and 1960s and in subsequent decades. But the overall impact is major economic growth in higher education, major economic growth in residential construction and commercial construction. So it leads to a post-war economic boom in America that we'll discuss in greater detail, I should say, later this week. However, the GI Bill did not benefit all military veterans or all of the folks that qualified for the bill. There was a group that was left behind to a certain extent, and that was African Americans, the black military veterans, the men and women that served in the military during the war, such as the Tuskegee Airmen, which we discussed in our last lecture, or the women that served in the Navy Nurse Corps and other military areas where African Americans served. They did not benefit at the same rate from the GI Bill as their white military counterparts. The overwhelming majority of the economic, educational, and social gains that resulted from the GI Bill went to white Americans. First and foremost, Black American veterans struggled to actually get the GI Bill financial benefits. This was a federal legislation, but it was administered and distributed at the local level, and local officials oftentimes were reluctant or straight up refusing to distribute the benefits to Black veterans, particularly in the South. But the GI Bill loans and stipends were disproportionately distributed to white military veterans. In addition, for the Black military veterans that actually were able to access their GI Bill financial benefits and spend the money, there were limited opportunities both in higher education and in housing. For example, higher education in the South remained segregated during the 1940s and during the 1950s. So if you were, say, a returning military veteran who happened to be African American from Mississippi, and you got access to your GI Bill funds that you had earned through your military service, you could not attend the University of Mississippi in 1948 or 1950 or 1952 or any point during the 50s or early 60s. Likewise, you couldn't attend Mississippi State, you couldn't attend Southern Miss, you couldn't attend Delta State. The predominantly white institutions of higher learning in the state of Mississippi and in the other southern states were off limits for African Americans because they were segregated. So Black military veterans returning to the South had the option of either leaving the region and going to the Northeast or the Midwest or the West Coast and enrolling in an integrated school up there, or if they wanted to stay in the South, they could use their GI Bill funds to attend HBCUs in the region, schools like Alcorn State, Mississippi Valley State, Jackson State, Tougaloo College, and Rust College in Mississippi, schools such as the Atlanta University Center schools in Atlanta, Morehouse, Spelman, what was then Clark College and Atlanta University, which is now merged into Clark Atlanta University, one school. They couldn't go to University of Georgia or Georgia Tech or any of the other white schools in the South during that time. The result is that HBCUs, which are underfunded compared to their white state school counterparts, HBCUs in the South fill up because they've got these GI Bill recipients who are trying to enroll, and they still have their African American high school graduates during this time trying to enroll in the school. And inevitably that meant that some military veterans that were African American fell through the cracks and were unable to use the GI Bill money for college tuition. So that is one area in which African Americans did not benefit from the GI Bill in the same way or at the same level that their white counterparts did. In addition, Black military veterans that wanted to use the GI Bill for home loans so that they could purchase a home, they often were restricted from purchasing homes in white neighborhoods. There were housing covenants, local ordinances, homeowners associations, all kinds of roadblocks designed to keep these new suburban neighborhoods lily white, all white. The fear was that black families, if they moved into a white neighborhood, that the property value of not only the home that they moved into, but the homes in nearby and throughout the neighborhood or the subdivision would decline precipitously. So if a black, for example, if an African-American family moved into a home in an all-white suburb and they're the first black family to move into this suburb, the fear was that amongst the white families in the neighborhood is the houses on either side of the home in which this black family moved in would decline in value, and the houses across the street would decline in value, and sooner or later the overall value of homes in the neighborhood would decline. Certainly a pretty racist and bigoted way of viewing home ownership and home equity, but that was the situation in post-war America at the time. The creator of the Levittown, New York development that I mentioned a few minutes ago famously said, you can solve a housing problem or a race problem, but you can't do both. And that's, he used that quote to explain why Levittown had to remain all white at the time that it opened, and for a decade plus after the homes in Levittown were built. African Americans were barred from purchasing homes in that neighborhood. So as we see with the fact that African Americans did not benefit at the same rate as their white counterparts with the GI Bill and were left behind economically and socially, I kind of want to use this as an example to address a larger point, a larger theme of this course, and that is that there are scholars out there who point out that New Deal era legislation, Social Security Act, as well as some of the job relief programs in the New Deal excluded black Americans, African Americans, from the benefits. We've discussed how the white Southern senators, white Southern Democrat senators, threatened FDR that they wouldn't vote for any of his New Deal legislation and he wouldn't get anything passed unless he made some specific stipulations in the Social Security Act, for example, that excluded tenant farmers and domestic service workers from Social Security benefits, and those just happened to be the two largest industries for black men and black women in the South at the time. Taken together, those New Deal policies as well as the GI Bill that excluded black Americans but provided substantial economic benefits in white Americans have led some scholars, such as Ira Katznelson, a political scientist, to argue, as he did in his 2005 book, that during this part of this era of American history, the 1930s and 1940s and 1950s, America had a form of affirmative action, but it was exclusively for white Americans. So Katznelson wrote this book. You can see the cover of the book in the image in the upper right-hand corner of the slide here. Title of the book is simply "When Affirmative Action Was White: An Untold History of Racial Inequality in 20th Century America." And like I said, it focuses on the New Deal era legislation, but Katznelson also describes in great detail how the GI Bill disproportionately benefited white military veterans at the exclusion of their black military counterparts. And it's part of the reason that inequality persists today in America is due to these landmark economic programs during the Roosevelt presidency that benefited white Americans in large numbers, but did not benefit black Americans. So that wraps up the GI Bill portion of the lecture, and now we will move on to discuss the end of the war. The end of the war, I mentioned that in 1944, it was apparent to America's political leaders that the military was succeeding, the American military, the Allied forces were succeeding, and that they, overseas, and that they estimated that the war would end with an American victory, a victory for the Allies, America, Britain, and the other Allies. And one of the main reasons why they were so optimistic was the events of the summer of 1944, and specifically Operation Overlord, which was carried out on June 6, 1944. The Allied Expeditionary Forces, under the direction and command of Dwight D. Eisenhower, launched an amphibious assault on the Normandy coast in France. The invasion was large-scale, consisting of 5,300 ships and 370,000 troops along multiple beaches. In Utah Beach, American troops advanced steadily and seized control of the area, as it was not heavily fortified by German forces. But on Omaha Beach, a few miles away, thousands of Allied troops were killed or wounded, but many more German soldiers were killed, and by the end of the day, or shortly after and the next day, America was able to overtake Omaha Beach, and despite all of the casualties, if you've seen some of the more prominent World War II movies, in particular the 1998 film Saving Private Ryan, that is about D-Day, or the beginning of that film depicts D-Day in great detail. So it was a major turning point in the war, because once American and Allied forces were able to overtake the Normandy coast, they were able to push Germany and the German military back on its heels as they marched through France. At the same time, in the immediate weeks and months that followed D-Day, the Germany's forces are being dismantled by the Russian army in the east, and the American and Allied forces in France are systematically going through the region and defeating Germany, or chasing the Germans out of towns and reoccupying those towns, liberating those towns, I should say. The Allied forces progressed through France and finally liberated Paris in late August. Germany would continue to fight for another 8 months before surrendering on May 7th, 1945. That was shortly after Adolf Hitler committed suicide in late April of 1945. And when the Germans surrendered in May of 45, the war in Europe was essentially over. It was over basically by the fall of 1944, but it was officially over on May 7th, 1945, when Germany surrendered to the Allied forces. Americans celebrated throughout the country on May 8th, 1945, and the Allied forces celebrated throughout Europe that same day, which is known as VE Day, Victory in Europe, VE Day. is the day of massive celebration, one day after Germany officially surrendered, ending the war in Europe. However, the Japanese military was still very much engaged in war with the American forces, despite the fact that American military forces had a great deal of success in the Pacific theater against Japan from 1942 onward. American troops won the Battle of the Coral Sea and the Battle of the Midway, which was a battle of sort of aircraft carriers and a naval battle. From that point forward, in 1943 and 44, American forces begin to strategically attack Japanese troops in a series of islands in the Pacific. Basically, they go island hopping from one island to the next to take over the island from the Japanese forces that were there. Japan would not go quietly. They would continue to fight against seemingly insurmountable odds and resources throughout 1944 and in the winter and spring of 1945. The most famous of the island battles during this sort of strategic island hopping occurred at Iwo Jima, which was a small island where an undermanned Japanese military contingent valiantly fought off the Americans for nearly a month before ultimately surrendering, and the U.S. Marines, in what is an iconic image, captured the small island. And in the image, there's a group of Marines sort of together planting the American flag at the top of Iwo Jima. It's one of the more famous images in the 20th century, and especially in one of the more famous images in World War II. Nevertheless, despite the American victory at Iwo Jima, Japan still didn't surrender. American troops captured Okinawa in June of 1945, and they were preparing to invade Japan once they had Okinawa. And an invasion of Japan was something that could very well happen, and that was a necessity in order to end the war. But American military leaders were fearful that an invasion of Japan would cost a number of lives. That ultimately, America would likely be successful, but it could cost as many as 500,000, American soldiers' lives, 500,000 or 300,000 to 500,000 American military casualties if they invaded Japan. And so Harry Truman, who at this point was president of the United States as Franklin Delano Roosevelt, early on in what was his fourth presidential term, had died suddenly in April of 1945. Harry Truman, his vice president, ascended to the presidency, and it was his decision. Did he give the go-ahead on a military invasion of Japan, and with the knowledge that it will cost many, many American lives, or does he opt to use the new technology that America had developed, which was the atomic bomb? And does he try to use that as a means to force Japan's hand while at the same time limiting American military casualties? That is the option that Truman opted to use, and he ordered a launch of the atomic bomb, which was dropped on the Japanese city of Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. The bomb killed an estimated 100,000 Japanese civilians. The first time an atomic bomb had ever been used anywhere in the world. A new era of warfare, and an incredibly deadly device that ruined Hiroshima. if you take a look at the picture in the upper right-hand corner of this slide, that is a look at Hiroshima in the aftermath of the atomic bomb being dropped. This is a day or two after the bomb had been dropped on Hiroshima. You can see that the whole city is in ruins. There's really no signs of life apart from that reporter or photographer who's in the picture there, the journalist that's in the picture there, kind of overseeing the wreckage. But even after Truman and the U.S. military dropped the bomb on Hiroshima on August 6th of 1945, Japan still did not surrender. So they dropped a second atomic bomb on the city of Nagasaki, Japan, 3 days later on August 9th, 1945. That bomb killed an additional 80,000 Japanese civilians, and after that bomb was dropped, Japan officially surrendered, and that ended World War II. They had a VJ Day, victory in Japan, similar to VE Day, victory in Europe, and that marked the end of World War II. So these are the military events of the summer of 1944 and the spring and summer of 1945 that resulted in victory for the Allied forces in Europe and victory for the American forces in the Pacific, as the U.S. And the Allies won World War II, and that ushers in a post-war era in America, and we will discuss that in our next lecture on Friday.